you all very much. I'm excited to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Jennifer Bundrick. Graduated with a BA from the University of Oklahoma, and she completed medical school at the University of Oklahoma in 2011. After that, she moved to Shreveport, Louisiana for general surgery residency, and after 2 years in the surgery program, she switched paths and completed general psychiatry residency. Dr. Bundrick moved to Denver, Colorado, and completed a one-year forensic psychiatry fellowship with the University of Colorado Denver Medical School. And she's been in a clinical practice at the Colorado Department of Corrections and a faculty member at the University of Colorado Denver Medical School since January of 2018. She has provided forensic psychiatric consultation and evaluation since 2018 with court-ordered competency, mental condition, and sanity evaluations. And she's also an associate program director for the University of Colorado Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship Program. She remains on faculty as a senior instructor, and in her spare time, she enjoys spending time with her husband and 2 children. So with that, I welcome Dr. Jennifer Bundrick.
I'm so excited to be here with you guys today. So this talk for today is going to be assessing the telltale heart, competency, and sanity in the courts. In my intro, summary for what I was going to be talking about today, I did say that I would bring up kind of more famous cases in forensic psychiatry, but I opted not to do that and instead to focus on things that I had personally experienced. So I felt like that might be more interesting. One of the quotes that I found as I was preparing for this talk is, "Give me just enough information so that I can lie convincingly." Implicitly, this is in Stephen King's On Writing. I've read the book probably 3 times, but I'm not 100% sure it's in there. I found it online, so, and Stephen King is probably my literary idol. And so I did invite him via Twitter to attend. I did not see him joining in. As I'm going to recognize that writers may not want to know every single detail about what a forensic psychiatrist does, I will try to not go too far off into the weeds. All right, our basic objectives for this presentation would be to understanding what training goes into forensic psychiatry for one to become a forensic psychiatrist, what the various fields in which forensic psychiatric evaluations are performed, because we do a lot of different things. And then we'll look at the differences between assessing competency along with assessing legal insanity. Primarily focusing on legal insanity within Colorado, as that is where I practice and I know our legal statutes better than elsewhere. I have a few specific cases that I've kind of gone through and highlighted some information about, but always happy to talk about more if interested. 2 quick shout outs. Dr. Spice joined me today. She is a friend and colleague who completed fellowship 6 months after I did. And so we've known each other for quite some time. I will add a correction to my intro. I was a previous associate program director with the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship. I stopped that a year and a half ago, something like that. And then also I will give a shout out to Dr. Richard Martinez, who is my mentor and the program director for the Forensic Psychiatry program in Denver, along with Dr. Thomas Frey, who is a forensic psychologist in Pueblo. So I stole some of their slides for this talk, along with Dr. Tim Allen, who is a forensic psychiatrist in Lexington, Kentucky, who gave me the title for this presentation and also gave me some slides to steal. All right, what's a psychiatrist? So these are kind of the famous psychiatrists that I could identify from kind of quick searches that I was familiar with. We've got Robin Williams' portrayal, which is excellent. I heard Baby Steps earlier, which is seen here. Freight Crane. We've got Arrested Development, Junke, I believe. And then, gosh, I can't think of her last name in the show, but Molly something in the TV show Scrubs. So if you think of a psychiatrist kind of in the archetype form, like most of the time people think, old white guy, not going to be dressed in tweed, possibly smoking a pipe, sitting in a chair with a long armchair that his patients will come lay down and he'll sit there and go, Not so much. So then what's a forensic psychiatrist? And so in order to get to the point of forensic psychiatry, it is a long road. So first of all, it starts with 4 years of college. For me, that was going through and getting my BA in sociology and criminology, because I had interest in going to law school early on. Changed my mind along the road. And then 4 years of medical school, either MD or DO school. The experience for medical school is the first 2 years generally are going to be very like in the classroom, learning biochem and organic chemistry and biology and anatomy and all that really fun science stuff. And then the following 2 years are going to be the hands-on rotations where we go through pediatrics, psychiatry, surgery, internal medicine, gynecology, all of those things. And then kind of narrowing down with what each student's interests. After medical school, each new doctor goes and does a residency where they learn more specifically how to do their field. In psychiatry, that is a 4-year process. During that time, you rotate in different fields within psychiatry, inpatient, outpatient, consult liaison, child, etc. My favorite was, nights where you spend a month working in the hospital, being the only psychiatrist within the facility for 5 nights a week for a month, which is exciting. And so, congratulations, you survived that 4 years of residency. You were a full-grown doctor. What is a smart person to do at that point? Another year of training, of course. And so you can do additional training in a variety of fields. Forensic psychiatry is a 1-year fellowship program, which focuses specifically on the intersection between psychiatry and the law. So what do we think of as forensic psychiatrists? I believe that Hannibal Lecter doesn't require much introduction. He is probably the most famous mythical forensic psychiatrist. I asked my husband if he remembered that he was a forensic psychiatrist, and he was like, I knew he was a psychiatrist, but that makes sense now why she was going and consulting him. And so I wanted to read some of the summaries for these different books here. As I started preparing for this talk, I realized I had never read any fiction books that had forensic psychiatrists in it. And so I have read most of these now. I haven't gotten to the Dirty Secrets Club yet. I have it downloaded, but I haven't gotten started with it yet. So I do want to read the intros that they have, the book jacket descriptions for these, because they kind of show the areas in which this is not what a forensic psychiatrist does. I will preface this that I've enjoyed all of these books that I've read. They've been very entertaining. They've just not been necessarily accurate. All right, so Kill Switch. Claire Waters is a dedicated forensic psychiatrist with unnervingly personal insights into the criminal mind. That part's accurate. Haunted by a disturbing childhood incident, Claire has always been drawn to those rare, untreatable patients who seem to have no conscience or fear. But one shocking case could make or break her career. All right, for this I would kill for. Natalie King has been hired to do a forensic psychiatric evaluation for the Children's Court, a custody dispute. Not her usual territory, but now that she's pregnant, she's happy to do a simple consult. My colleague here is shaking her head. Turns out Jen and Malik's breakup is anything but simple. He claims she's crazy and compulsive. She claims he's abusing their daughter. What if all the claims are true, or none? How can Natalie protect the child, and how does she work out where her concerns for Chelsea slide into her growing obsession with her own lost father? Two side comments on this one. First, as I noted already, any psychiatrist, including forensics or not, could tell you that custody battles are not simple. Probably any parents in the room could tell you that that would be the case. They are very complicated and drawn out and painful processes. I almost stopped reading it after that, but I'm glad I didn't because it was interesting. And second, not included in this, is that she also has bipolar disorder and stopped taking her medications at the beginning of the story, and so there's a lot of consequences of her being a person who has bipolar disorder untreated. Emma in the Night, I just finished this one last night. One night, 3 years ago, the Tanner sisters disappeared. 15-year-old Cass and 17-year-old Emma. 3 years later, Cass returns without her sister Emma. story is one of kidnapping and betrayal of a mysterious island where the two were held. But to forensic psychiatrist Dr. Abby Winter, something doesn't add up. Looking deep within this dysfunctional family, Dr. Winter uncovers a life where boundaries were violated and a narcissistic parent held sway, and where one sister's return might just be the beginning of the crime. I will add on this that I initially picked up this book because it included a forensic psychiatrist, but lo and behold, she's actually a forensic psychologist, which it immediately discloses early on into the book, but the summary nevertheless confused her. Since I haven't read Dirty Secrets Club yet, I'll hold off on that, but it's essentially saying that another forensic psychiatrist has her own secret hidden problems that she is now investigating and part of the investigation. So what's the difference between a clinical psychiatrist, you know, kind of the smoking that pipe and listening to people talk on a couch, and a forensic psychiatrist? In clinical evaluations, our goal is to treat patients. We want to provide them with appropriate evidence-based treatment plans, come up with a diagnosis. Generally, ideologically, we want to trust what our patient tells us to be true. And then we advocate for our patients. In forensics, a little bit different. Our goal is to assess for a specific legal purpose. We are answering a legal question, often for courts. We are seeking to verify the veracity of evaluated claims. And while trust is generally an essential component of patient-doctor relationships, suspicion is the name of the game for forensic evaluations. Malingering, which means feigning a mental illness for some form of secondary gain, like getting out of criminal consequences, getting a disability claim, getting money from a lawsuit, so on. So that occurs in a substantial portion of forensic evaluations. And so you can understand why malingering may be more common in forensic evals as opposed to clinical ones. In the forensic evals, you have the potential to gain your freedom or money. In a clinical one, sometimes there's some money to go along with it. If you're hoping to seek a forensic eval later on, or if you're trying to get a custody case solved or disability, or most often the most valuable thing for malingering in clinical situations would be getting meds for abuse. Within forensic psychiatry, there's a wide range of work that we do. Criminal evaluations may be the subject of kind of the greatest interest for this group, but we also do evaluations for asylum, for child custody, for guardianship, civil commitment, risk assessments, civil and tort case evaluations, and then correctional psychiatry I included on here as well. As my day job outside of forensic work is working in a clinical practice within a prison. This probably seems like a bit of a Russian doll thing you get with one box and then you open it up and there's more and more and more. So within the fields of forensics and within the exams of forensics, within the criminal exams, there are a variety of exams that you can do. Competency to proceed is one of the specific types of evals that we do. Restoration of competency, meaning of somebody now competent. We do criminal responsibility evaluations, which would be our Sanity, mental condition evals, post-conviction sentence hearings, juvenile transfer hearings, which would be of value for your case retrospectively, had that been in a time when 14-year-olds had the right to be in a child court. A forensic psychiatrist could have come in and done an evaluation of her history, her social history, her trauma history, and said, yo, this is why this girl should be kept in a juvenile court and shouldn't be sent to prison for the next 30 years. We have to do evaluations of Miranda waivers and false confessions. Mentioned competency, there are a variety of different competencies that you can have both in the civil world and criminal world. You have to have the competency to consent to treatment. You have to have the competency to refuse treatment. You have to be competent to enter a contract, get divorced, be a parent, manage your finances. In the criminal world, be competent to confess, Miranda, to waive counsel, to put in a plea, to be sentenced, to be executed, or oftentimes more simply put, of competent to proceed with a case. So, here's a little bit of our history. I'm not going to do too much of it. U.S. Supreme Court established the standard for what's required for somebody to be competent to proceed in 1960 in Dusky v. U.S. One of the shortest rulings within the Supreme Court. They indicated that in order to be competent to proceed with one's legal case, the defendant must have sufficient present ability to consult with a lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding and have factual understanding of the proceedings against them. For the one case in question, the Supreme Court Justice noted it was not enough that the defendant was oriented to time and place, meaning they knew who or when and where they were, and to have some recollections of events, because that's what the trial court judge had said was, okay, he has those things, so he's good enough to go. So if you can imagine, if that's all it took to be competent, pretty much a 5-year-old could be considered competent. The idea of criminal responsibility stems from our humane moral compass. As stated by Judge Bazelon, our collective conscience does not allow punishment where it cannot impose blame. What value or purpose would there be in punishing someone who's insane? There is the notion of actus rea versus mens rea as two separate legal concepts required for one to be guilty of a crime, the guilty act, the guilty. Over time, the legal world has attempted to further define what we collectively consider insanity and lacking a guilty mind. Various tests have been designed in furtherance of this goal. In 1723, the wild beast test was the rule today. This one stated that one must be totally deprived of understanding and memory, does not know what he is doing, no more than an infant, a brute, or a wild beast. I've always considered this one of my favorite definitions of insanity. While it's not appropriately encompassing or understanding of mental illness, it certainly paints a picture. Courts in 1800 suggested the offspring of a delusion test, meaning that in order for one to be considered insane, their actions must have been the product of a delusion. They did something because they had a belief that it was untrue. In 1838, Dr. Isaac Gray, a psychiatrist who's considered the father of forensic psychiatry, although there are often many fathers of forensic psychiatry, he authored the treatise on medical jurisprudence of insanity. In this, he proposed a volitional test, the concept of irresistible impulse, meaning that one must have had an irresistible impulse to commit the act in order to be considered insane. 1843 really set the stage for defining insanity to this point. In Britain, Daniel McNaughton believed that the Tory party was conspiring to kill him. In his defense, he decided that he would assassinate the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel. Attempting to do so, he missed, and he killed his secretary, Edward Drummond, instead. McNaughton's lawyer successfully used the insanity defense, and he was found NGRI. Queen Victoria was not happy about this, but there had been several attempts on her life at the same time frame, in which other people had been found not guilty by reason of insanity, and so she was not pleased with how things were turning out. So she tasked the law lords to come up with a new insanity standard. And so what they came up with was that for one to be insane, to establish the defense on the ground of insanity, it must be clearly proved that at the time of committing the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from a disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know he was doing what was wrong, and whether the accused at the time of doing the act knew the difference between right and wrong. To this day, Britain and many of the states in the U.S. use this set standard, including Colorado. Exclusions include acts undertaken as part of antisocial conduct or as a product of intoxication. So you can't shoot up a bunch of meth and say, it's okay that I killed these people because I was on meth and I didn't mean to. In 1955, the American Law Institute attempted to modernize the insanity offense. They defined insanity as a person not responsible for criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct as the result of mental disease or defect, he lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. So this is essentially the McNaughton rule plus the volitional component, the irresistible impulse. This is a standard for legal insanity used in the federal court, and it's also used in about a third of the U.S. Of note, there are 4 states that explicitly do not allow for the insanity defense. A severely mentally ill person commits murder in Kansas, Montana, Idaho, or Utah, they're hosed. So, since we're in Colorado, I did want to include the legal language within our state statute. The statute says that insanity includes a person who is so diseased or defective in mind at the time of the commission of the act as to be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong with respect to the act, or that this person's condition prevented them from forming a culpable mental state that is an essential element of the crime committed. I always summarize this a little bit more simply as one is so mentally ill at the time of the crime that they either didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. As with most things, you have to legally define everything, and so there is a legal definition of mental disease or defect within statute, and this includes those severely abnormal mental conditions that grossly and demonstrably impair a person's perception or understanding of reality, that are not attributable to the voluntary ingestion of alcohol or other psychoactive substances. You'll note that there's no specific mental illnesses listed in this definition. Most commonly, to have a severely abnormal mental condition that severely impairs a person's understanding of reality, one would need to be experiencing symptoms of psychosis. However, there have been cases in which PTSD, for example, have been successfully utilized in NGRI claims. We further define culpable mental state, which is included in one of the prongs for insanity. This is for each of the different crimes that you can commit within Colorado. There are different mental states that go into those crimes. So one would commit a crime intentionally, one would commit it knowingly, or recklessly. You can see that these kind of exist on a graduation or gradation. If one's using an insanity plea, the mental state required is going to be most often intentionally or knowingly, more often intentionally. It takes very little functional mental capacity to reach a threshold of reckless intent, but more so for each of the other two. All right. Now we have our legal background for what makes somebody insane legally. So how does a forensic psychiatrist figure out if they've met that threshold? So I mentioned earlier the irritation about the simple child custody evaluation. They're just not that simple. Even the fairly easy cases, the easy calls, require a lot of work. I rarely put in less than 10 hours on a case, often much more. Sometimes into the high 50s, 60s, 70s. I include different educational aspects for kind of more rare issues that would be experienced. And so all of these cases, they start with the crime. And so whenever we're hired for a case, or whether it's privately hired by the defense or the prosecution or third court-ordered evaluations, we start with crime. We get all the available discovery, police officer reports, the witness statements, the evaluee statements, the forensic work, blood, fingerprints, etc. More helpfully, any video or audio recordings of the crime, and recordings of any police interviews that occurred immediately afterwards. We review their past criminal record. While an individual's history of previous charges can still mean that they were insane at the time of the crime, it's still important to know how long ago those other crimes were, why there wouldn't be any concerns for insanity at those times. We view pictures of the crime scene. Some psychiatrists visit the crime scene, though that would really be excessive for the majority of cases, but for like the cases of the Unabomber, whose real name I'm blanking on, the forensic psychiatrist involved went out to his little one-man hut and visited the scene there. We look at their past psychiatric and medical records as far back as we can get. We look at these records that have accumulated since the time of their arrest. So often documentation from their jail screening intakes. When they first go in, they get seen by the nursing staff and goes through a checklist of questions and then documents kind of their appearance and behavior. Sometimes that's very revealing. How long after they were incarcerated until they saw a mental health provider? Did they ever see one? Were they placed in special housing? Did they go to general population? Are they on meds now? What effect does that have? We could seek additional collateral records and information like school records, work records, prior neuropsych testing, brain imaging, lab work. All of that is possible to pursue, kind of depending on the appropriateness for each case. Sometimes also talking to other resources like parents, spouses, siblings, or children. Had a lot of cases where that wouldn't really be appropriate since they were the victim in the case, and generally not going to holler up at the victim of the case and be like, hey, I'm trying to investigate the mental status of the person who assaulted you. Please tell me about it. So that would be more cautiously undertaken. Now we get to our clinical interview. All this stuff is stuff that we do oftentimes before we even meet the person. And once we do meet them, and I put clinical interview, but I should say a forensic interview, before we do the forensic interview. After we meet the evaluee, we want to get as much information as we can. first thing we're going to have to look for, besides going through all of our past history, is we got to make sure they're competent, because you can't really pursue somebody's understanding of what was going on at the time of the crime if right now they're too mentally impaired from their mental illness to be able to work with you or work with their attorney on pursuing an insanity defense. Yes, very direct questions in these evaluations. In clinical psychiatry, we try to be a little bit more kind and considerate and not try to push people too hard or offend people. Forensic psychiatry a little bit less so. The gloves are a bit more off and we're a little more blunt. Sometimes there's specifically trying to provoke people to see what kind of reaction we can get from them. Particularly if we have concerns about their taking of some aspect of this. And we get very detailed descriptions of the crime. One of the things that's included as a consideration for this evaluation would be a policeman at the elbow test of, hey, would you still stab that guy if there had been a police officer right there next to you? And seeing if, yeah, sure would have. That would tell you something about what they understood about the, at least legal wrongfulness of their act. More factors to consider. What's the evidence that this person had a mental illness before the crime, during the crime, and after? Serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia don't resolve in a few days. So if they were psychotic only at the time of the crime, but not really before, not really after, it's a red flag. The big thing to look at is the motive for the crime. Is there a non-psychotic motive for why the evaluee would kill this person? Money, anger, previous conflict? Was there any planning or preparation that went into the crime? If someone attempts to cut down a stranger to bust up with a machete while shouting gibberish at them and then walking off with a machete in their hand, that's a hint that something is not right with their thinking. There is not an obvious motivation there except for a psychotic one. They didn't plan it out. What was their functional status before the crime? We're going to have a lot more concerns about someone's mental health affecting their thinking at the time of the crime if the weeks beforehand they abandoned their job, barricaded themselves in a room for days at a time, not showering, not eating, calling the police every day about somebody trying to kill them, than you would for someone who was maintaining the status quo before crime. Again, serious mental illnesses that demonstrably affect one's ability to understand reality do not come and go overnight. How was their behavior in jail after they were arrested? Those who were insane at the time, I often say that they're placed in special housing, suicide watches, documented as having hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thoughts and behavior, poor hygiene of themselves and their cells. Their cells are all erect, they're pooping in the walls, all of that. And they often get prompt referrals to see a mental health provider within the jail. We then try to explore their thoughts about the behavior and actions at the time period around the crime. Again, looking for evidence of psychosis is a big part of this. Hallucinations, hearing things, seeing things that others don't, voices, spirits, demons, etc. Was the TV giving them messages? Did they think a specific part of the Bible was written just for them? They had special powers or a mission from God? They believed someone was trying to harm them. What substances, if any, were they using? For how long? How much? Intoxication doesn't necessarily exclude the possibility of insanity, but we need to really be clear as to what effects the intoxication did have on their thinking and behavior. They have an underlying mental illness, often associated with people abusing substances. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the reason they committed crime is because they're high, still because they were mentally ill. We're trying to get down to answering the question of understanding wrongfulness and those things we're looking at. Did they try to, avoid detection in some way? Were they disguising themselves at the time of the crime? Did they try to clean up the crime scene? Did they bury a body or just keep the dead body sitting on the floor of the room for 3 days until the cops showed up? Did they toss a gun off a bridge or keep it on a kitchen table? Did they take off running when the police arrived? Did they run for Mexico after the crime? Did they say to the cops, of course I killed him, that bastard slept with my wife, he deserved it? Or did they say, of course I killed him, he was Satan, he was going to destroy the earth if I didn't? The indication of guilt or remorse. They called the cops, and then we're looking at lack of evidence of psychosis, that they weren't having hallucinations or delusions or confusions, disorganization, like nobody observed those things about them at the time. They deny those things happening at the time. And I'll emphasize that just because sometimes there are irrational actions within a crime that otherwise have a lot of irrationality, that does not exclude an insanity finding. Dr. Philip Resnick, who is one of the biggest bigwigs in forensic psychiatry right now, uses the phrase rationality within irrationality, meaning that one does a lot of irrational things, such as stabbing someone in broad daylight in a crowded area without disguising themselves, but then they leave the scene and toss the weapon afterward. It doesn't all of a sudden make their actions sane, but it shows that one is still capable of some organized behavior and thought in the midst of irrational, illogical behavior. If someone claims they were psychotic at the time, they say killed their spouse, we delve into the details of that psychosis. If someone is hearing voices that tell them to do things, we call these command hallucinations. Those people who experience command hallucinations do not feel compelled to act on these commands. And if they do feel compelled to act on them, they don't feel compelled to act on them without discrimination. So if they are having command hallucinations and they aren't acting out all of the commands, what kept them from acting out, or what led to them acting this command out? Do they have some rational motivation that went behind why they did it? And then therefore when the voices says, hey, go ahead and kill this guy, it's like, yes, I should because I wanted to anyway. And did they try to do anything instead of doing what the voices said to do? What did they think would happen to them if they didn't do what the voices said? A lot of times for people with insanity, they'll say things like, you know, I believed I would die. I believed so-and-so would die. I believed the world would end. Things like that. And then if they initially refrained from acting on it, then why did they ultimately do what the voice said? Why did they give in? Their psychosis only involved delusional beliefs without voices. What was that delusion? They believed their spouse was cheating on them? And if so, would that warrant homicide? Why would that homicide be not wrong if they committed it because they thought they were having an affair? Or did they believe their spouse was trying to kill them? So, did they find out if this was true? Did they try to escape being killed by their spouse in any other way besides just trying to kill them? And what happened if they did that? And then why didn't it work anymore? That's really kind of broad strokes versions of what we're looking at in sanity evaluations. All right, a couple of case discussions. I have blurred and changed information in these cases since they are personal cases that I have seen. So this information is not actually selected entirely of the cases I've seen, but similar. All right, so in the case of MN, we're going to do a competency evaluation first. So this is a 33-year-old male who is charged with assault, attempted assault, trespassing, and criminal mischief. And then, first thing we're doing is we're talking to the attorney, ideally, but not always do the attorneys respond to our phone calls or emails before we see them. In this case, his attorney did. His attorney said that the reason she asked for this evaluation was because he told her he needed notarized documents that said she was in fact his assigned attorney. More concerningly, he wanted notarized proof that she did not have any internalized headphones. Before meeting with him, I reviewed the information in discovery that included the details of the crime. He essentially broke into a family member's home because he believed they were in danger, despite numerous verbal reassurances by that family member. Police arrived. When they did, he was combative, and then picked up trespassing, mischief charges, and assault. Next day in jail, he was still pretty out of it, and he attempted to assault the jail staff while he was being moved to special housing. Then in the discovery, it also included emails that he'd sent to governmental officials about various visual and auditory hallucinations he experienced in the last year, beliefs that people could put thoughts in his head, and along with his specific importance in various things, and fears about people being out to get him. And it was written in, I think it was 30-something pages. Yeah. It was completely disorganized and very hard to follow. Looked at the jail records before I saw him. Had very bizarre, disorganized behavior initially. Was drinking his own urine, self-harming, cutting pagan designs into himself, saying people were robots. They were able to verify his outpatient meds that he'd been taking, or had been taking up until a few months before he got arrested. After he got to the jail, a few weeks And he started taking antipsychotic meds. He started appearing to like improve. That was what was documented. So come in thinking that it's all right. It sounds like he's got a psychotic disorder going on. Go in and see him, and we go through kind of the basic background that we do in any psychiatric evaluation. One's developmental history, education, work, relationship history. He gave a fairly classic pattern of schizophrenia with like kind of graduating from school, starting out at college, and then deteriorating his performance abilities because of worsening psychotic symptoms. He started smoking marijuana as a teen, other drugs kind of socially. He did mention with his religious beliefs that he thought he was the devil and could control what happened with people's souls. He did talk about specific things in that he had in the past heard voices through the TV, the computer, headphones that would tell him to kill himself, that they were Nazis and they wouldn't stop until he blew his brains out. But sometimes they would say nice things, like they loved him. There was very mixed messages. He heard voices of famous people in his head, like Trump, Biden, Putin. And these ranged in intensity from nonstop, all the time, couldn't stop hearing voices, sometimes kind of faded in and out. And then we kind of move on to the competency portion. In his case, he was able to really understand all of the factual information related to his court case. He knew who the people in the courtroom were, what they did. He understood what he was charged with, what the consequences could be. He was fairly optimistic for his case, including the idea of possibly pursuing an insanity plea, which did not seem unreasonable. But he knew what could happen if he tried other ways. Ultimately, he said that he thought he could work with his attorney, that she was mostly on his side, and thought that she probably had a good point in getting a comp eval done. Said that if I'm not competent, I probably shouldn't be presenting myself in court until I am. And so I diagnosed him with schizophrenia and opined him to be competent to proceed. And this one gives a little bit more stark contrast. Another kind of 30-year-old male arrested for kind of minor charges. In this case, the attorney did not ever respond to me, so I didn't hear any specific reasons why they wanted the evaluation. But ultimately, I went in and met with this gentleman. It was a very abbreviated interview because shortly upon entering the televideo room, this is a video eval, he just started rambling at me fairly incoherently and yelling at me and cursing at me, and pretty much proceeded to do so, making no real rational statements in the 45 minutes that I attempted to interview him. And then ultimately when I terminated the interview because we weren't getting anywhere, and clearly he is psychotic, waited for the officers to escort him to his room, he continued to stand there and shout and point at me with the volume off throughout the time. But he was incompetent to proceed. All right, so last thing is going to be a sanity eval, and then we'll kind of leave it for questions. Miss VP is a 37-year-old female charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder, along with several lesser charges. There's a lot of records that are available to review for this case. This included police reports, witness statements, crime scene, victim photos, previous competency evaluations, prior psychiatric and medical records from the jail, after her arrest, outpatient records, and prior prison records. There was also police interviews with family on this case that were included in the discovery records. So for this case, the police were called late in the afternoon for a call of a male who was down. On arrival, police and EMS found a male who was laying on the ground and bleeding. CPR was started immediately. He was transferred to the hospital, subsequently pronounced deceased. Our person of interest here, Miss VP, her mother was also on the scene, and she said that her daughter stabbed her and that she was crazy. She said her daughter had stabbed her and her other son in the apartment. She said CP has schizophrenia. She said CP had been in her room playing video games while the family finished dinner. She randomly came back out, got 2 knives from the kitchen, took them back into her room, and came back out and put them as the shape of a cross on the kitchen table, and then went back into her room to play video games. Hours later, she came out and just started stabbing everyone. There's no provocation, no biting, and she hadn't said anything while she was stabbing everyone. The mother said they all loved each other. So the police walked up to the apartment, and they ordered CP to come out of the apartment. She walked out, was placed into handcuffs. Saw blood on her hands, her clothing, her shoes, and it was visible throughout the apartment. She declined to talk to the police. On arrival at the jail, she told them that she had a history of schizophrenia with prior treatment with antipsychotic medications. She said she'd been off of it for a year, but had been hospitalized a month ago. She appeared flat, meaning like no facial expressions, no emotional expressions. She was struggling to focus on the screening interview, and she appeared to be seeing and hearing things that was paranoid. They put her on a suicide watch to keep an eye on her. Nursing staff said she initially refused to speak to her attorney, and they saw her just talking to herself in her cell. Over the following week, she started to engage a little bit more with staff, but typically wouldn't leave her cell. Her behavior ranged from flat and withdrawn, often laying in the cell on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, to belligerent. It improved over about 2 months with the start of medication. I met her for the first time about a year and a half after her arrest. Her kind of background is that she'd been born in another country and briefly lived as a refugee and came to the United States at a very young age. Her mom and her siblings, their father died when she was very young. One of her other brothers died from a car accident at age 8. And then at 15, she started using drugs, skipping school, and getting into trouble. She dropped out of school, but she got her GED through Job Corps. She briefly got into college, but then decided to get into the military at 19. A few days after her arrival in the military, she had a mental breakdown and was hospitalized and discharged from the military. It was described as seeming delusional, paranoid. She committed her first significant legal offense at about age 20 and spent about 2 years in the county jail before then she spent 10 years in a prison. After she got out of prison, she was in and out of parole for a few more years due to violations. Ultimately successfully completed parole after a few years. Then she's mostly spent her time in the years preceding her arrest for this case playing video games. She wasn't working or in school or on any medications after she was no longer on parole. The sanity evaluation, I kind of try to pick something that seems like a time frame that would give them some recollection for things that had been going on in the months before their crime had been committed. So if it's in the early spring of the crime, I'll ask, okay, what was going on around Christmas? And then try to get a timeline of events from Christmas until the arrest. But for her, she said that she had been admitted to a psych hospital on her own because she had been walking around town paranoid and she thought that she was the daughter of a Greek god and that she had superpowers. She started feeling overwhelmed by the voices, so she went to the hospital. However, they wanted her to take meds and she said meds didn't help. So she refused and she was discharged. She couldn't come up with anything else that was really different over the last couple of months before her arrest. She talked about spending her time writing complaints to a video game company about discrepancies in their game, and she felt that she was being cheated because she wasn't receiving certain things in the video game. She was posting about this and her grievances on Facebook as well. She talked about experiencing in the weeks or days or weeks, she really wasn't certain, before the arrest, of feeling like this person that she had known 3 years ago that was just an acquaintance was actually her soulmate and her spouse. And in the days or weeks before her crime, she started to believe that her soulmate was being raped. She thought that this was happening because the voices were telling her, sort of telling her that she was being raped, that he was being raped. Not exactly in those words, but essentially giving her that impression and confirmed it when she questioned if that's what was happening. And then her belief that she was the daughter of a Greek god persisted. She developed a belief that she needed to die in order to ascend, receive her powers to save her soulmate from being raped. So the day of her crime, she continued to hear these voices and experience delusions that her soulmate was being raped by her dead father and his friend. She believed that if she died, she could go to heaven, gain her powers, and then be able to save her soulmate. At some point, the voices were continuing to tell her that like this needs to happen, you need to kill yourself so you can get your powers. And so she tried to stab herself in the knife with her stomach. It didn't work. She said it just left a dent. And so she's like, okay, I guess I can't kill myself. Then she went back to playing video games for a little bit, And then she started feeling, for some reason, that if I kill my family, I will then be able to successfully kill myself and then be able to save my soulmate. And so she did. She attempted to stab her family. She said, when I started to kill my family, when they were yelling at me to stop, I stopped. I realized it was wrong. So she stopped, went into her room, and waited for the police. She recalled thinking, what have I done? And she was really happy when the police arrived because she thought they would kill her and she would ascend and get her powers and be able to save her soulmate. She remembered a little bit about coming to the jail and getting on medications, and she continued to have these beliefs, but they faded in their intensity over the next year and a half before I saw her. At one point, when they had faded, she, suffered enough guilt for what she had done that she asked for the death penalty. And so on my second evaluation, the sanity evaluations, we try to see them more than once because we want to make sure the story stays the same. Unfortunately, when I went back to get the story the second time around, she had been off medications for the last several months and needed to be compensated. She was now so grossly psychotic that she couldn't participate in the interview, and so she was now incompetent. Ultimately, I determined that I had enough information from her case that by the time that she was insane at the time of the crime, but now incompetent to proceed. In conclusion, forensic psychiatrists are medical doctors. Advanced training in psychiatry and forensics. Competency involves a person's ability to understand court and help their attorney right now, not what was going on with them 2 years ago, not what's going on with them a year from now, but how are they functioning right now. Sanity is someone's ability to understand whether what they did at the time of the crime was wrong, and if they were able to form that culpable mental state. Ultimately, if you get a character that you have that is mentally ill, or you want to write about a forensic psychiatrist, please call in. I'd be happy to discuss it with you. I think there are many other psychiatrists that would be also happy to discuss theoretical behaviors that would be appropriate for a forensic psychiatrist that are not necessarily depicted in writings that I've seen so far. Happy to take any questions. Thank you all for having me.
So you were describing the person you were seeing over the video, male, I believe, and he was yelling and cursing and rambling and all that. So my question is, how difficult is it to separate the possibility that he might just be staging this? I kept thinking of Klinger from MASH, who dressed as a woman. Of course, it was for laughs in the show, but that's his idea, is to convince the army that he's actually insane, and he put on an act. So is it particularly challenging to separate somebody, or do you have enough history and background that you kind of separate that, this is a temporary, for my benefit kind of game?
Great question. As malingering for any reason is definitely part of all of our evaluations. And the answer is, of course, it depends on each different case. For this case, I had a lot of history that showed a lengthy history of schizophrenia, and that he improved significantly in the past with prior incompetency when he got on meds and taking them. He went back to no longer shouting and cussing at people. In some cases, you don't have any background information. You don't have any information from the jail, either because they haven't written anything on him, or they don't respond to your request for those records, which also happens sometimes. The attorney doesn't answer the calls. You don't have any real additional information. And so with those, I probably wouldn't have quit the interview. I would have kept going for a while to just try and work on seeing the mental state of whether he's just shouting and yelling at me about things that make sense, or if his thoughts are so disconnected from one another that it's clear that they're psychotic. For this case, really within the first 2 minutes, I could tell he was grossly psychotic, so I didn't need much more time than 2 minutes. But if it was kind of an uncertain case, you would just let them talk longer. So that's why a lot of times that I start my evaluations with kind of their background, their personal story, because usually people are able to relate their own personal story more clearly and more organized than they can necessarily if you're asking them about their psych history, their psych experiences, and specific legal questions that they may not have more than simplistic understanding of.
So somebody can be schizophrenic and still be determined to be competent, right?
Yes.
But what about, so if they stop taking their meds, there's no way, then, so most of the time they stop taking their meds, then they're not competent. You can't force somebody to take meds though, right? Or can you? What's that?
Depends. So you can be schizophrenic and still be competent even if you're not on medication. The sanity evaluation that I discussed, when I first saw her, she had only been back from competency restoration for a couple of months, maybe 2.5, maybe 3. And she'd gotten a month-long acting injection of an antipsychotic while there. And so she'd really only been off of medications for about 2 months or 6 weeks the first time I saw her. But then by the time I came back to see her the next time, it had been another 6 weeks or so, and she had just, from there, her mental functioning was no longer to where she was able to assist in her defense. And at that point, she was no longer competent. Given that she had a history of being treated with medications involuntarily, while being restored to competency, I expected that she would. So if somebody is determined to be incompetent and they need medications in order to become competent, but they have a mental illness like schizophrenia that clears in response to medications, and we know it does not clear without medications, they can pursue an involuntary medication hearing with the court to order medications involuntarily for the express purpose of restoring them to competency.
Oh, okay.
That's going on right now with the person who shot at people in psychiatry.
It had been, although I think he got whisked away to federal court.
But, yeah, they decided that not that they can take the meds till the illness.
Jennifer, when you do your analysis, is that ordered by the judge or is that ordered by the prosecution? How does that process work?
Variety of people, really anybody within the court system can order or request a competency evaluation. Most often it's the defense attorneys because it's their client, they're the ones that see them.
That's true.
Yeah, and so they make a motion to the judge and say, I'm concerned that my client is incompetent because of X, Y, and Z that I have seen. And then the judge motions for a competency evaluation.
As you were talking, it seemed to me that there's quite often a fairly sizable gap between the time of the arrest and the time of the evaluation, whatever evaluation, whether it's a sanity or competency or whatever. What happens in that space? At one point you were talking about a year and a half, 2 years. What in that space, what is going on?
For that case, I cut out a lot of information because I didn't want to bore anyone. And so for that case, in that year and a half, she was in and out of the state hospital getting treated for incompetency. Her defense attorneys, I was privately hired in that case, and her defense attorneys had been trying to get insanity evaluation done, but she kept being incompetent, and so they weren't able to get it done. And so that's
So in the meantime,
she was in the jail, and then she would be incompetent again, so they would send her to the state hospital, get her back on meds, get her cleared back to competency, sent back to the jail, she deteriorated again, become incompetent again, go back to, and back and forth.
so is the attorney asking for continuances and things like that?
Yeah, so, I mean, once competency has been raised, everything stops on the case, and so everything just has to go on pause. You can't really do anything else because you have to then find, is this person competent to engage with their attorney, to engage in anything in the legal process? There's no hearings, there's nothing. All that is answered. And it used to be a lot slower than it is these days. There was a lawsuit against the court services at the state hospital because of how much of a gap in time there was between requested competency evaluations before they were done, and then once somebody was opined incompetent or deemed incompetent by the court, before that they would get to the hospital. They would just be sitting in the jail for months, waiting to go to the state hospital and treated, oftentimes, before they would finally get down to the state hospital and get meds. And so, through lawsuits, that's the way the world changes. They have hired a bunch of new staff and have been able to kind of cut down on the delays and the amount of time it takes to get a competency eval. But in long cases, competency is something that fluctuates, and so somebody who could be competent at one point at the beginning of their case, a year down the road, is now no longer competent.
In the case of the young woman who stabbed her family, I'm really curious how you arrived at her insanity. Because when she obviously had the ability to refrain, because when her family said stop, she stopped. She obviously knew what she did was wrong because she went and waited for the police. So how did you weigh those factors? What other factors did you weigh against that to arrive at insanity?
So the factors that were most compelling for this case, because with most cases, there's gray areas. And so we definitely spend time going, here's what I think, here's the things that go against what I think, and trying to balance that out. And so for her case, there was no motive to kill her family or try to kill her family except for a psychotic one. And the ability to refrain wasn't there. She stopped when she started doing it, when they said, stop it, quit stabbing us. She couldn't refrain from when the voices were saying, your soulmate's being raped. They're being raped. You can't save them unless you die. You can't die unless you kill your family. And so she felt the only way that she could stop this was to do what the voices were saying was the only way this could be resolved. And then in the midst of doing that, that's where the rationality came back in. It was like, whoa, stop, you're hurting us. We're your family. We love you. Don't kill us. And when she went to go sit and wait for the police, I don't know if I would argue that just going and sitting and waiting for the cops to show up with blood all over your body is necessarily totally sane. And in her case, she was also, waiting for them to come in and shoot her and kill her. She believed, even though she didn't try to resist arrest, she was sure that they would come in and shoot her. And so that she would ultimately die and ascend and get her powers and save her soulmate. And so, while there were factors of rationality within it, as a whole, her motives were insane. And she did not know the wrongfulness of her actions at the time that she engaged in them. She knew them when her family said, stop, don't kill us. She was like, you're right, I shouldn't kill you. But she didn't at the time that she was doing it.
As a practical matter, the competency evaluation, how long can a case maintain waiting for the person to become competent? It seems to me, I remember reading recently of a case where like 10, 15 years had gone by, and they finally found the person competent. But where does that leave the process?
It depends somewhat on states. Each state has their own slightly different laws about this. In some states, it was, they have up until half of the amount of the top crime. So if they had a potential for a 30-year sentence, they could keep them there for 15 years trying to restore them to competency. I think they're working without necessarily a legal change on this. They are working on trying to be a little bit more, like, if this person is not restored within a reasonable amount of time, we're going to say that they're never restorable. And at that point, are they still so mentally ill that they're dangerous to themselves or dangerous to others or not able to take care of themselves, and therefore we can civilly commit them?
So you, as the forensic psychiatrist, would have to make that opinion?
We include in our evaluations, it's now required in all of our reports, an opinion about restoration within the foreseeable future. And so oftentimes, probably more often than not, most people are restorable. We're going to say, yes, in the foreseeable future, they're likely to be restored with medications, with education, et cetera. But if somebody's been sitting in the hospital getting re-evaluated every 3 months, and they're still incompetent, eventually somebody's going to say, this person's incompetent, they've been treated with this, this, and this, they're not getting better, they're likely not going to get better.
You can't let him out or give the opinion unless you find that he's not a threat to himself or the other person. So you could maintain that person in a psychiatric hospital forever if you couldn't make that finding.
Ultimately, if somebody is deemed by the court as incompetent and not restorable, then they would pursue whether or not they met criteria for civil involuntary commitment. And if they didn't, then they'd be released. There is somebody that I have seen that has happened with, that they were determined to be incompetent and unrestorable. And I think in this case, they immediately pursued civil commitments, and he was civilly committed for some time, and was pursuing trying to get out of the state hospital.
Well, thank you so much.